As Roman is relocating, let me just say that he is an adjunct assistant professor in the Faculty of Education. And from 1987 to 2015, he was the director of the Ukrainian Resource and Development Center at McEwen University. And he managed a number of international development projects in Ukraine. And I know that you and Jerry are a great team, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thanks very much. I know that all of you know about the new law on higher education that Dr. Kvit put forward a year and a half ago, and the first law of the coalition government that is formed in Ukraine. I guess the questions I'd like to sort of try to find a way of answering are, what are the conditions that Dr. Kvit finds himself in? He's an advocate for change, he's an activist, and on the other hand, he's not an oligarch, not a rich man, and judging by the declaration he made in his own statements. And so the number of methods that are available to him to advance reform of higher education are limited, and in part because as an individual he's not included, I think, in the great debates around the economy and the nature of the state that is emerging in Ukraine. So in order to try to get at this, what I'd like to do today is, based on the learning I'm taking from Jerry, is to try to propose a framework that we might use in our cluster to get at research topics and have some sort of orderliness to it. Now, Jerry talked very clearly about path dependency, and I think there's a tremendous importance in that societies don't simply transform willy-nilly, they proceed based on the inheritance that they have in which they take into a new challenging environment. So in this particular discussion, what I'd like to do is suggest that we pick up on this notion of critical cultural political economy in education, which Susan Roberts and this Robert Dale have suggested has in it three categories or levels by which one can examine the ensemble that constitutes, let's say, higher education or education in general. And I think that those three levels, and in a moment I'll speak about, as Jerry did, of a civilizational level, the level of societies or national societies, and also the question of then networks, like, for example, the higher education network in Ukraine. So in this particular approach, I think the strength of it is that critical cultural political economy assumes that we ought to be looking at the subject historically, that is to recognize the historical nature of the systems we're looking at, to look at them globally and understand them in the context that we've just heard about, European higher education in general, to understand them comparatively, and also to center on the what I call the conflict or the transitions that are going on. Now, in Ukraine, the former Soviet Union, those conflicts, I think, have to be rooted in the nature of post-communist society and its conflict with the emerging, yet to be defined, capitalist society in Ukraine. So that we begin to understand that to understand the dynamics of Ukraine, we need to focus on where there are these conflicts and to try to finesse out the various factors that are influencing the dynamics. So first of all, let me just say a couple of words about the civilizational level, or this grand conflict between post-communism and the emerging capitalism. So the collapse, of course, of international communism represented by the USSR, and consequently the rise of theocratic and various kinds of nationalist regimes is the current chapter of our geopolitical examination. It's still taking shape. So I'm going to just read a definition of what postcommunism is so that we have a common understanding. Leslie Holmes, and I'm going to quote here, says postcommunism is the fall of communism was a comprehensive revolution entailing the unprecedented simultaneous transition from a centralized state economy and a polity to a privatized economy, and at the same time political democratization. So widespread insecurity results with the reduction of the welfare system, the emergence of unemployment. There's a great deal of political instability. We can see this, of course, through the emergent political parties, the question of legitimation of these new forms of state, the frequent elections, changes of government. The population itself dislikes grand theorizing. They don't want to be experimented upon any longer. And with it comes, of course, the collapse of the ideology that was the glue that kept all of this together. And it devolves into a vacuum which all these other ideologies are now filling in various ways. So very often in post-communist societies there is an unrealistic assessment by the people, by the players that are experiencing this, of the degree of independence they have, and perhaps an undervaluation of the emerging global economy. And as a result, very often what we see is cynicism in the political system. We see the emergence of a weak culture of compromise, and the underdevelopment of civil society. So in this, we see the emergence, of course, of much more corruption that was there in the Soviet times, a moral vacuum, as we've heard, and diminishment in the social solidarity, the cohesion of the society. Nevertheless, all of this, and I've ended her quote, all of this is a historical phenomenon which is in motion and is passing. Post-communism itself is changing. Certainly after a generation in Ukraine, it has a different form. So that what I'm going to suggest is that we need to study the reform of universities in Ukraine within this kind of model where the economic considerations and cultural forms of society are interactive and mutually imposing on each other. And in other words, we're not looking at this from say a reductionist, vulgar Marxist perspective that the economy determines the educational system. Hopefully this analysis, this critical analysis, will have some more nuance to it. So that's with respect to how we approach the civilizational level. Now, at the level of societies, whether they're national societies or regional societies, and here this concept of borders is always unclear, particularly in Eastern Europe. We can look at and we need to understand that these societies are all quite different from each other, even though they're coming out of a unified system. They're different, of course, geographically. They're different in terms of their history, their social capital, the economic resources that they have available to them, particularly where they have energy. So, for example, resources was a principal one. It's in this area that the concept of path dependency, I think, is very important, because societies begin to revert to their core fundamental characteristics in order to try to evolve. And we can say that rather than a sort of a linear theory of change, not a historical theory, what we're being guided to is to see that future change is dependent on the strengths of all the different components of the post-communist society as it begins to clash and with this emergent capitalist society. So chronologically, we know that when communism was collapsing in Eastern Europe, it happened first in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, that is to say in Central Europe, They were the first to depart. And then subsequently we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union with its 15 republics, all of which are declaring independence. We see the dismemberment of the Central All-Union Communist Party. And then slowly we see the disappearance of communist parties in each of these national formations. So there's a dynamic going on at the political level. Of all these 15 republics, there's a process of uneven development. It's not identical in each location. In fact, we see that only really the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as well as Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine have the kind of external relations and internal resources and political leadership that's required to create various kinds of lasting forms of political system, of democratic systems of government. That is to say, I would say the Russian Federation, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, and so on, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, remain as forms of non-democratic political systems. So this is a major divide between, let's say, 6 of the republics that formed the Soviet Union and 9 that, for various reasons, have not yet shown the ability to form a democratic system of governance. So it's important, therefore, to focus on the specificity of Ukraine as a national democratic society and to distinguish it, to identify what distinguishes it from these other countries. What are the driving factors? Where is the conflict between the societies and their economic systems? So with respect to Ukraine, I think it's key to knowing that there were several fundamental transformations that are going on simultaneously. We have of course, the emergence of it as an independent and sovereign state with its own military forces. At the same time, we have the emergence of a constitutional democracy in Ukraine, which is embodied in a whole series of constitutions that have been drafted and redrafted. And of course, we have this transition from a communist economy to a capitalist economy. So Eastern Europe, and Ukraine in particular, have vestiges of the communist system, which, with its hierarchical and autocratic system, remains in conflict or in opposition to clearly defined and stable capitalist economies, largely drawn from the EU and in some respects from the United States. So, having said that, I think what we can do is formulate a binary polarity, if you just imagine from A to B, and attributes of communist society, attributes of capitalist society, and to try to gauge where Ukraine fits on these continua between the two. For example, let me just give a few examples here. The continuum of state ownership. On one hand, state ownership, 100% state ownership of the economy, to an economy based on private ownership. Today, clearly, Ukraine, the government of Ukraine has sold and had stolen perhaps a substantial portion of what it owned as resources, and starting in '91, and the consequence that today's economy has a mixed character. Production itself, that is to say, production based on industrialization of the Soviet model, on one end of the polarity to capitalist consumerism. If we ask, has there been change? Clearly there's been a change in deindustrialization, in part influenced, of course, by the global electronic revolution, but in part influenced by indigenous demand for consumer goods. The population of Ukraine is looking for consumer goods, and therefore, which, of course, the communist system of production was poor at producing. As a result of that, we see that social wealth and financial wealth is being distributed more or less in the communist system, where perhaps it wasn't entirely a classist society, but an egalitarian society where the ratio of income perhaps was 3 to 1, 5 to 1, maybe some members of the elite, the Communist Party, had a little higher ratio, but in general the society was a fairly equitable one where wealth was distributed, to a society where Ukraine today has become extremely unequal. There's been I don't know what ratio would be, but I'll just put a number to it to give you a sense. Wage income of people might be 150 to 1 or 200 to 1 compared to what it was in the Soviet period. And with that, of course, we've seen the decimation of the middle class as it was defined in the Soviet period. So we have an extremely rich, tiny minority at the top of society, and an impoverished mass of people that have relatively little purchasing power in their economy. So also communist society and media were state-controlled. Capitalist society, the media are owned by different oligarchs, so there's a private media, but the degree of independence of those media, of course, are continue to be limited under the new oligarchy system. And so in this system, we need to begin to discuss education with respect to this economic environment that it finds itself in. Now, in communist society, I'm going to suggest that virtually all education was paid for by the state, 100%, virtually 100%. But we have seen that in capitalist society, Ukraine has moved in the direction of private schooling, private universities, and in fact there has been was an explosion over the past 20 years from a rather small number of institutions that were called universities into the conversion of what were then called institutes, now called universities, plus a whole bunch of private institutions, so that when Dr. Krit took over, he identified some 806 institutions that are called universities in Ukraine. Now he's reduced it back down to 314 or 315, but their plan for university reform calls it to come down even further, down to 60 or 70 universities, something comparable to what we would recognize as an appropriate number of universities for a Western capitalist society. Finally, I'll just make the point about bureaucracy, state bureaucracy, and the educational bureaucracy. Soviet society developed a very particular kind of bureaucracy, I think driven by the fact that it was a one-party state, essentially run by the Communist Party, and so this bureaucracy, I think, has given rise to a great deal of passivity. People were taught and required not to initiate, and not to have personal vested interests in investment. And that kind of ethos, that kind of bureaucratic management is of course, penetrated the entire society and penetrated the university system. And because of the collapse of the economy, many of those Soviet managers in Ukrainian universities continue to be in their place today. And do not want to retire because there's no income going to be had, and are trying to transform their institutions into private enterprises in many ways, where students are paying the tab in order to access higher education. So I think then that in our particular cluster that we might begin to understand this conflict that exists at three levels between the outgoing post-communist system and the incoming capitalist system yet to be defined. It certainly is an economy that is parasitic. It's capitalism, some have called it crony capitalism. Not clear at all to me which direction it is moving, whether it is crony capitalism is giving way to some kind of social capitalism because of the resistance of, let's say, the socialist nature of the previous system. It's those questions that I think this research project is going to examine the individual conflicts to see who's winning and what the nature of this post-secondary system will be in the near future. Now, in the paper itself, I did produce a series of suggested research ideas for each of these three levels, and maybe if there's a chance in the question period, I'll introduce some of those.
Well, if you can do it in a couple of minutes.
Well, yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just go very
Sure.
quickly then.
Sure.
At the civilizational level, for Ukraine today, I think it would be worth examining the differences between Russian post-communism, Ukrainian post-communism, Polish post-communism, and so on. There is a variation, as I described, in the uneven emergence of these different peoples. And that comparison would be instrumental. It can be studied through legal documents, through the various constitutions we've had, through the various struggles around new legislation at universities, because the question of reform in education universities has been there from 1991, but it's only really happening now because of events in 2014, last year, with the Revolution of Dignity. At the national level, I think what is really keen for research to examine is this nature of the new economy that's emerging in Ukraine. And it relates to what Jerry had to say earlier about the various kinds of universities that have emerged in the West. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the people in Eastern Europe misread the West because they know little about the West, obviously, relatively little. And so they are assuming that what they see in Germany, or assuming what they see coming out of the French tradition and so on, that those are necessarily the models for universities of the future. And I think we will provide a service to the people undertaking university reform in Ukraine by discussing these neoliberal tendencies in the universities. Olenka very kindly sent us a notice recently where I believe it was at Simon Fraser University, a corporation simply has taken over the MBA program for its company. Like, it is not teaching an MBA program for the general public. It started an MBA program for TELUS. Now, this is a very unusual sign of something happening in a university, the traditional university model. And I think that people in Ukraine ought to know that this is what the future is beginning to look like here in the West. And I think it might give a very different context for the discussion of university reform. Oh yeah, just a couple of other examples of what needs to be discussed. On the whole debate in Ukraine, they're focusing on quality education without reference to the economic framework. And of course, they're unable to resolve the question of quality because it's the economy that predetermines, what the standards for quality education are going to be defined as. It's very interesting for me also. I want to personally investigate whether these Western projects that we've had, that we've introduced. For example, I was involved in a project with Yuri Konkin in introducing the model of inclusive education to Ukraine, which comes out of a Western model where our societies are wealthy, where we have a large middle class, where the school systems can afford to experiment and so on. Now, we've transferred this model of inclusive education to Ukraine, where the conditions are entirely different. And yet, I think if we examine these specific attempts, we will see that there is a certain amount of progress. Like, some of these ideas and pieces of them are accepted, some are put into motion. What are the reasons why some are accepted and others are not? Like, that would be for me, it would be an interesting question to look at. And then finally, we can look at, well, there's so many other questions that can be looked at. Let me just see if I can find a few for them. The whole business of empowering students is something that the Ukrainians have raised as a possible element of institutional change. The whole question of charitable foundation, charity giving, is that genuinely something that will help reform the university system? Is the reduction of the number of universities, as I mentioned, harmful, or is it when there's this explosion of universities and hundreds of thousands of young people go to post-secondary education in Ukraine that could not have or would not have gone necessarily before to something called the university, is that harmful or beneficial for Ukraine? Anyway, there are many, many questions I think that can be asked within this general framework that is historical, is comparative, is specific to regions, and examines both economic and social cultural questions within the same framework. I'll stop there because I'm all over time.
Thank you very much.